Hey everybody, Milton Davis here. Just wanted to come on live for a few minutes to talk about a subject that is hot today. Today the trailer dropped for the upcoming movie The Woman King, produced by Viola Davis, and I must say this is a project that I've been anticipating and looking forward to. I'm happy to see the trailer. I like some of the things that I see in it, and I like what's going on. There's been a lot of discussion online about the history behind the movie. Some people have been feeling some kind of way about it. People who know a little bit about the Kingdom of Dahomey and its involvement in the slave trade. So I kind of wanted to go back and talk a little about it. It's a project near and dear to my heart because I actually was working on something similar. But before I talk about that, I'll just start from the beginning. When I consider myself an armchair historian, I know just enough to be dangerous. And as I was doing research to write my Sword and Soul stories, I came across this book, and it's called Amazons of Black Sparta. And I think most people who know about the Minnow, or some people try to call it Black Amazons, were first introduced to them by this particular book. And when I read this book, I was really fascinated about it. I was fascinated with the history behind it. And it's a book that really focuses more on the training and the discipline of the Minnow, and it talks about some of the wars. Particularly, it talks about the two French Dahomey wars that took place, and it talks about the Minnow and their involvement in that. But for me at the time, I was really just inspired by the warriors themselves and by the women themselves. And it was actually the book that inspired me to write my book, Woman of the Woods, which is loosely based on the information that I found in Amazons of Black Sparta. Years later, after I met Charles Saunders, I found out that, of course, I was the only one inspired by that book and that history. He was inspired by it long before I did, before I was, and that's what was the energy behind his book, De Soye. Charles actually was created the first black woman sword and sorcery character in the Soye, because he was asked to contribute a story to a collection of an anthology that was being made called Amazons, and he created the Soye for that anthology and wrote a number of stories about it afterwards. So, I mean, that's how I was initially introduced into the history of the Minnow and the Kingdom of Dahomey. So, years later, around about 2016, a friend of mine got in contact with me and said, "Hey, Milt, I know this guy, and he's working on a project, and he's looking for a writer. And based on the project, I think you'll be the perfect person to work with him." So I'm like, "Well, cool. Well, give me his information. I'll get in contact with him." The gentleman was a brother by the name of Willie Simmons Jr. And Willie Simmons had worked for a number of years in Hollywood as an assistant director. He worked on Lethal Weapon. He worked on Weird Science. Worked on a lot of popular movies during that time as an assistant director. But because of an illness, he had fallen out of the industry for a while. So I got in contact with Willie, and Willie said, "Milton, I want to work on a project. I want to do a a movie about the Minnow of Dahomey." And I was like, "Cool." I read a book by them back in the day. I actually wrote a book based on them, Woman of the Woods. So I think this would be something interesting to work on. Now, this was my first time somebody had ever approached me about working on a movie project. So it was kind of daunting to me because I was, having to write a script and different things like that. But Willie had tons and tons of resources, and he introduced me to all these different resources. We had a company we were going to work with out of Guinea that had a large dance troupe that they traveled around the world. We were talking with them about them possibly, supplying the people and the actors for the movie. We met with a brother living in Atlanta who used to be an ambassador to Benin, which was formerly known as Dahomey, and he brought a lot of hands-on information there. And so I started doing my own research, and that's when I started learning more and more about the whole political situation during that time, and it was really unique and complex. Some of the books that I read, I'll show you some of the books I read here. This was like one of the first books that I got. It's called Wives of the Leopards. And this was a very interesting book because it didn't focus so much on the Minnow and the wars that Dahomey fought with the French. It focused more on the culture and the society and of Dahomey, and it gave a lot of details about the politics and the relationships between men and women in the in the kingdom, and how it was affected by their relations with the different kingdoms that surrounded Dahomey and stuff. So it gave me a lot of detail and insight on the culture itself. There are also some other books that are out there, not some of the best sources in the world, because you kind of have to weed out some of the European opinions when they're dealing with, you know, African countries and African nations. And one of the other books that I read here was called Dahomey and the Dahomeans by F.E. Forbes. Now this is actually an account of a British diplomat who was sent into the interior of Africa to meet with the king of Dahomey and talk to him about possibly, you know, ending their involvement in the slave trade. Because around the time that and it's interesting that, you know, that they chose this particular time period for the warrior queen. I think I have an idea of why they might have done that, but it's just my opinion. But I'm really looking forward to the movie to see what they do with that. The Woman King, I'm sorry about that. But basically, you know, the British had decided that, okay, we can actually make money without slavery, so we're going to abolish it. And now that we're abolishing it, we don't want anybody to do it. So they put a blockade on Whydah, and Whydah, or Ouida, whichever way you pronounce it, was like the main slave trading point in that region. And so they sent a number of diplomats to the Kingdom of Dahomey, Ebome, which is the name of it, in order to try to convince the king to end the slave trade, or not to participate in the slave trade. And this book is basically a document talking about that particular trade, talking about that particular one of the particular trips. Now, in addition to reading that, I actually read some fictional encounter. Well, I read some fictional encounter that include the Dahomey people, and I also read a book that I wasn't expecting to give me information about Dahomey, but it actually did. The first book I'll talk about will be the fictional book, and this was a book written a while back called The Dahomean by Frank Yerby. Now, for those of you who don't know who Frank Yerby is, at one time, Frank Yerby was not only one of the most successful black novelists in the United States, he was actually one of the most successful novelists in the United States. A number of his novels were made into movies, and he was known for doing historically based fiction. For a long time, most of those stories were written based on European history. During the Civil Rights Movement, he actually kind of got confronted by some of the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement. They say, you know, hey, you're this popular author, and, you know, you're writing these amazing books, but you don't write any books about black culture. So his response to that was basically to write The Dahomean. Now, in his book, he chose to use, I find it in here in the intro, he's talked about who he used for his source, for his information. And I'm going to see if I can find the book, the person's name that he decided. Yeah, it's a book by a gentleman by the name of Melville J. Herkovitz. He felt like that particular person gave the most unbiased research on the Dahomean culture and the Dahomean kingdom. Unfortunately, this is a book that I have not been able to find. I've looked for it all over the place, could never find it anywhere. If you find it, any resources about it, please let me know. I'd love to read that book. But Frank Yerby chose to tell about Dahomean culture from the male point of view. His main character is a man, and he does talk about some of the main things going on in Dahomean history. So he does give some details that I noticed and I saw in other books as well. But he was type of somewhat of a melodramatic writer, and was I can say a person of his time. So there are a lot of things that you'll find in reading this novel that you probably won't really care that much for, but that was what he wrote about. And I wanted to read this book because I wanted to get a feel of someone taking this history and writing something that was a fictional novel from that perspective. Now, I mentioned the book. I mentioned one thing about Whydah. Whydah, or Ouida, whatever you choose to call it, was the major port for slave trading in the region of where Dahomey existed. As a matter of fact, for a while, it wasn't a part of Dahomey until Dahomey actually attacked it and took over the port, and then there was a port that they used for doing all their slave trading. I was able to actually find a book on Whiter, and it talked about the city itself and the politics of the city and the things that goes on. And one of the things that comes out of this is that when you take a look at this history, you really find out what a complex situation was going on there. The relationship between different African kingdoms, the relationship between these kingdoms and the Europeans that were trying to gain influence there. Because you got to realize this, the connection and the relationships between Europeans and West Africans went on for almost 400 years, and before the Europeans were finally able to colonize Africa. And this was a relation. It wasn't a situation where one group of people was coming in and telling the other group of people what to do. It was actually a relationship. You know, they were diplomats. They were exchanging, ambassadors and different things like that. And when you start looking at this situation, there was also some Afro-Brazilians that were involved in all this, in this whole complex situation, which makes it interesting. So the one source I'd say that I discovered that I didn't expect that I was discovering came in this book, which was released a few years ago, Barakum by Zora Neal Hurston. If you're familiar with this book, you know it is about a black man who was one of the last people to be sold into slavery and brought to the United States. And when I'm reading this book, and I'm reading this guy's description about how he was captured and sold into slavery. He was actually captured by Dahomeans. And the method that he was described, how it was done, matched some of the other descriptions that I read in other history books. So it was like actually reading about a person from their actual account, actually going through this. And it was really fascinating to me that it was, that he was telling his story, and his story was collaborating other things that I had read in history, and that's what made it part of my research, because I'm like, this is actually validating a lot of the stuff that I've read historically. And again, when you're reading history about Africa, you're always trying to weed out what the European influence and the European opinions that tend to skew those type of descriptions. So that's some of my book sources. I think I showed them all to you. And of course, like I tell people all the time, Google is your friend. There's a lot of information online. Of course, you have to be careful about the sources, and you have to be careful about who's writing this information. But I was also able to find a lot of good information as well as photos as well. But I need to say that a lot of the photos that you find of the minnow were taken after Dahomey had been defeated. And a lot of the pictures are of the minnow are basically come from some of these tours that people were doing throughout Europe, saying these are the minnow and that kind of stuff like that. They're not pictures that were taken when the kingdom was at its height. Another interesting thing that I found online, I don't know if you guys remember, but when they first announced this movie, Lupita Nyong'o was scheduled to be in this movie. But because of conflict, she wasn't able to do it. But she actually took a trip to Benin, and she visited the capital of the former Kingdom of Dahomey, or Dahomey, and she actually talked to some of the people there and got some of the first-hand history from the people in Benin, and I thought that was really interesting as well. That's why I was kind of disappointed when I heard that she was not going to be in the movie, because I saw that she was doing her research, and I believe everybody involved in this movie did their research. Just from seeing the trailer, I see a lot of things that are reflective of the history and the research that I did over years ago, and that's one reason why I'm excited. Actually, it was because of the announcement of this movie that we decided not to do our project, because we were working on this movie, and we were, I was working on the script. We were meeting with people and stuff like that, and then Black Panther came out. And of course, when Black Panther came out, that's when most of us who didn't read the comic books were introduced to the Dora Milaje, and then we discovered that the Dora Milaje were based on the minnow of Dahomey. And not too long after Black Panther came out, I think there were at least 3 different studios that announced that they were going to do movies based on the minnow of Dahomey. And Viola Davis was one of those people that announced that. Willie decided, hey, these people got the contacts, they got the money, They're going to be able to get this thing done. They got the head start on us, so we might as well just scrap that project, which we did. However, I still have the notes, I still have the research, and I still plan on one day writing a novel based on the information that I was able to find, because I think there's an interesting aspect when you tell this story, that as you read it, you will discover some things that I don't really want to discover some things about that situation and the politics going on at that time, which are going to be very eye-opening and reveal a lot about the complexity of what's going on. So all that being said, I am looking forward to the movie. I'm really looking forward to see what they're going to include in the movie. I think we all need to remember the fact that this is a movie. It's based on the Minerals of Dahomey. It's based on the kingdom. So I don't think you should go to this thing expecting some accurate historical storytelling here. I mean, that's never happened in Hollywood. No matter how close they try to do it, there's always going to be stuff done for theatrical effect and different things like that. And so if you're going to this movie thinking that you're going to get an education on the minnow, on Dahomey, I don't think you should expect that. I think you should look at it as a starting point and something that will probably raise some questions and stuff. So to talk a little bit about some of the people who are not really that happy because of the fact of the Kingdom of Dahomey and what it represents, because it does represent an aspect of the slave trade, which was not that favorable. The way I see it is that no matter what you do when you talk about different kingdoms and empires, you're never addressing some of the negative things about that. I mean, we all sit down and we watch movies about British royalty and aristocracy, even so much to the fact that we're seeing, multicultural representations of that. But as we're watching these movies, we're never really thinking about that we're watching a movie about an empire that was built on the backs of slavery and conquering other people. We're in there for the moment and we're enjoying those things for the moment. And I kind of feel like that's kind of one of the aspects that you could probably bring to this when you're looking at the Woman King. Not saying that you should do it. I mean, everybody has their own opinion. Everybody's going to have a different way of looking at it. Some people aren't going to watch the movie because of how they feel about anything that brings attention to the Kingdom of Dahomey and what it represented when it represented the other Africans as well as African Americans. But it's up to you to decide what you want to do. It's something that I think everybody has to deal with on their own, and that's basically it. So, hey, thank you for you guys who sit around and listen to me rant about this. It may or may not mean anything to you, but again, saw the trailer. I was excited by what I saw, and I'm looking forward to the movie. I'll be there in September, and I hope to see some of you guys there too. Take care. Peace.